Hello and welcome to Coffee Time with Abgadeas. I'm your host, Abgadeas, and this is the show where you just might see me take a sip of this coffee, which is actually coffee in there today. But more or less, I'm just here to rant and rave about anything and everything that interests me. And today is more or less of a follow up video, a complimentary video to the video I did yesterday. I kind of wanted to go over some of the other derailments that have happened, some of the narrative and lack thereof in the mainstream media about this stuff happening, as well as the effect it is actually having on the people of East Ohio, as well as states that are far away from East Ohio. And like I was warning of in my video yesterday, even up here in Ontario, Canada, there are people seeing the effects of what's happened in Ohio. So, first off, I should say that all these other derailments that have happened, it has been extremely difficult to find sources or any mainstream media, any reliable quote unquote outlet that is actually talking about them. And I kind of wanted to just have a sidebar about this for a minute. The reason I usually always go for a mainstream media source is not because I think what they're saying is reliable, but more or less that if they're saying something that makes the American empire look bad or makes corporations look bad, it is almost certainly true. It is past the point of deniability. A lot of these news companies are subsidiaries of larger companies that have stockholders, they have deals with large corporations. We've seen places like the New York Times heavily coordinates with the CIA and the State Department. So it's no surprise if corporations kind of have that same hand in the media landscape. So generally, if a media source is saying something, a mainstream media source is saying something negative or that could be viewed as negative about a corporation or the government, I'm under the impression that, well, it may not be true. It is definitely a sign that there is some truth to what they are saying. And I think from there we can kind of do some analysis and deduce what we can, make reasonable assumptions where we have to, and really go from there. So I will apologize on some of the sources for these first few sources I'm going to use because, like I said, it has just been so difficult to find anything. The first one here is about the derailment in South Carolina. This is one of the very few articles I saw talking about it. The only other one is from what looks like to be an investment kind of advice site, I guess, like a financial guru type of site. And really, all they say is that a train derailed. And then the rest is talking about the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And then that's much the same here for the Fox News source, is basically just saying that, yeah, it derailed. People were there. From my understanding, you can see in this video, you can see them actually putting the train cars back on the tracks, and it doesn't look like any chemicals were spilt or anything like that. But I don't really think that's the issue here. Here is the train crash that happened in Texas. I was trying to find confirmation on whether or not it was the truck that hit the train or the train that hit the truck. I don't know if that'd make too much of a difference. It seems like the semi-truck driver is most likely at fault here. And the main thing, the only chemical that seems to be released, or that they're saying was released, was diesel fuel from the truck itself. Nothing from the train. They had reopened traffic hours after this particular train derailed. So that one didn't seem to be as much of an issue. And then here again, I'm going to come back to this particular news segment in a bit, but this is talking about literally right after I published my video. My girlfriend sent me a link talking about this train derailment happening, or that happened in Detroit Thursday morning. Again, they're saying no evidence that the hazardous materials were exposed. And you even had a statement from the Van Buren Township Public Safety. I don't know if it's council or a board or exactly what that would be called. But you can see no hazardous material released, no reported injuries. So apparently all the other derailments haven't really caused any issues. And what's even more surprising about this, here's an article from Newsweek. Right here at the bottom of the article, apparently this isn't even that uncommon of an occurrence. There's about 1,700 derailments that happen per year, at least on average from 1990 to 2021. I tried to find some solid numbers for a country that would compare in terms of the quantity of rail lines and how much they depend on rail lines. I felt like Russia would be a apt comparison, also being a somewhat capitalist system and having a vast amount of rail lines that are actually in operation, but I couldn't find any firm numbers for that. The only numbers I could find were for the EU, which to my understanding, the EU has quite a bit more rail line than the US, especially in terms of passenger rail line. But the EU experienced about 1,300 derailments, I believe, in the year of 2021. I think that number is also maybe a bit of a bad statistic to use as a basis, as I would say anything after 2020, there's a lot more factors that will go into comparing those numbers. Like for the EU, I was struggling to find numbers that were before 2021, and the reason I believe numbers after the year 2020 are unreliable is because the pandemic affected a lot of the shipping, a lot of the import-export industries of a lot of countries, so that means rail lines were being used significantly less, and the figure from the U.S. is an average from 1990 to 2021, so that I think is a relatively good number to go by for the U.S., but I was just having a bit of trouble finding a comparable statistic for a single country. The best one I could find was that EU statistic. And like I said, it sat around about 1,300. And it seems like that is in line with how many happen in the United States. It seems like maybe the United States is a little bit high. But it just seems like this is emblematic of the overall trend that is evident in capitalism itself. I'm going to get into that in a moment when I redress that news segment, but capitalism necessitates the optimization of profits. If you want to stay in business, you need to be able to compete with your competitors, because if someone can do it for cheaper, or if they can do it faster, or if they can do it more efficiently, and that leads to more profits for the corporation seeking the transportation services, then the companies that even want to do the right thing, that want to pay their workers the right amount and want to give them enough sick time and paid time off, they're not going to be able to compete with the rest of the industry. They're going to lag behind. Their profits are going to lag behind. Like I've spoken on before, if it is a publicly traded company to any extent, there is an obligation from the CEO, the CFO, the chief executives of the company. They have an obligation to their shareholders to optimize profits. So when shareholders look at the rest of the industry and they say, well, these companies have these kind of profits performing these same kinds of services you're doing in a similar amount, why are your profits so much less? Excuse me. And then when the chief executives of the company explain, oh, we were just trying to do right by our workers. We were just trying to do the right thing. We wanted to keep everybody safe. Every single shareholder in that room is going to get furiously angry and demand that they cut every wage, every safety regulation, every rule. And that is exactly what these rail companies did, which I'll also get to. Let's get to it right now. Actually, let's move this up the docket. So this is an article I actually kind of meant to cover in yesterday's video. One of the reasons I felt a supplementary video was needed. It's actually a direct result of these actions that caused the, in my opinion, at least from my analysis so far, that led up to the derailment in East Ohio. So this has been an ongoing battle for about a decade now to try to replace the Civil War era braking systems. And no, we're not talking about the Spanish Civil War here that happened in the early 1900s. No, we're talking the American Civil War. Happened in 1860, I think 64 was the year. But we're talking 160 years ago. 160-year-old braking system. Obviously, the brakes themselves that are being used on the trains aren't 160 years old, but the technology and the system they're using is 160 years old. And I'm sure a lot of people out there would say, you know, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Tried and true is sometimes better than new and fancy. I should have said that the other way, it would have rhymed, but on top of the braking system, you had several U.S. legislators try to push to kind of enhance the regulations around high hazard, flammable, dangerous chemical materials, especially when they're being carried on a train. And this specific train that derailed in East Ohio wasn't designated as that. It didn't have to operate as that, despite having flammable, hazardous materials on them. Obama actually proposed, maybe not himself, but his administration tried to improve safety rules, but it just ended up, after a bunch of lobbying, ended up just focused on crude oil. So had nothing to do with these kind of chemicals like the vinyl chloride that is having all these side effects and this detrimental effect to people's health. They entirely killed provisions requiring rail cars carrying hazardous flammable materials to be equipped with electronic braking systems. And that was specifically under the Trump administration. So you can see Obama, Trump, Bush, Biden, it doesn't matter. They're most interested in appeasing the shareholders, the wealthy individuals that effectively run the corporate duopoly that America is. And as a result of that, no matter how many times you go to vote or what kind of populist right-wing politician you vote for that says they will do A, B, and C, even if they get the chance to do A, B, and C, they're going to be squashed into oblivion. You're telling me, in order coming from the Obama administration, the highest office in the country couldn't even get this done, and you're expecting that a couple populist senators or a particular wing of either the Democrat or Republican Party is going to be able to reverse course on effectively what has been the way America has operated for the last 250 years. It's just unrealistic to me, in my opinion, and I think that's emblematic. It's kind of showcased in the fact that when I tried to look for these stories, I found it very difficult to actually find any coverage on them. When you look up Detroit, South Carolina, you look up Ohio, now it's coming up with articles on the train derailment, but specifically South Carolina, Detroit, Texas is much the same deal. If we look up Texas, the news stories, at least the ones that are up top, have nothing to do with the train derailments. And obviously these train derailments are a little bit less of a deal than the one that happened in East Palestine, Ohio, because none of these resulted in the spill of hazardous chemicals, but it almost feels like that was more so luck than it was a sign that everything is actually okay. You kind of bundle that in with the fact that 1,700 derailments happen in America per year, and it seems like it's no big deal. But obviously these things are only getting worse and worse, and it's a matter of chance every single time that one of the tankers that is carrying hazardous material is going to be breached as it gets derailed, and it's going to cause an ecological disaster. And we're just rolling the dice every single time, and it seems like U.S. lawmakers, the corporations, the rail companies clearly aren't going to do anything to remedy this or to try to get out ahead of this to prevent these kind of things from happening, because they really have no incentive to. They have insurances. When these trains derail and all these chemicals spill, they get a big insurance payout. Clearly, the government, the federal government, state government, aren't going to hold them accountable to any degree. A $25,000 check is enough, as I mentioned in my last video, is enough to make the issue go away. So why would they do anything? And that leads me back to the news segment that was posted on The Hill. So this is Rising. I'm going to guess that's a morning show, kind of just based off the color tone and how everything is brighter. I don't know if Rising is associated with The Hill. I'm also not going to play this clip. If you really want to, feel free. The link will be down below. Go take a look for yourself, see what you think. But this is an article about the derailment in Detroit. But they shortly go on to talk about the derailment that happened in East Palestine. And the female news anchor gets to a point where she's suggesting that this is a cause of the United States developing into a fascist state. Well, I agree that America is transforming into a fascist state. I think it's a bit arguable whether or not it's there now, and fascism is a result of capitalism in decline. Capitalism in decline doesn't always lead to fascism, but it's one of the standard reactions of a capitalist empire that is losing its influence, losing its power, losing its control. But I think making that point takes away from just the core idea that incentivizing profit above all else not only makes this inevitable, but ultimately necessitates this. Because again, you can have government regulations, you can get corporations on board for a while. Every time in this system, every time you have an FDR New Deal, every time you have a Civil Rights Act, it seems like it's this monumental kind of step forward. But it's really not. And that's what I was trying to talk about on my last program with Dylan Daniels over at Entitled Millennials, because there was this reaction from the police department over Tyree Nichols' death. They instantly fired the 5 officers that were involved, criminally charged the 5. There was one white officer that was fired but wasn't criminally charged, at least at the time of making that video. I haven't caught up with that story yet, so I'm not sure if that white officer has been charged. But the point I was trying to make is that we shouldn't take this action, this immediate action, the firing of these police officers, as too much of a victory. Because this very well could just boil down to the town, city council, mayor, whoever made that decision, doing a calculation, basically, saying that these are 5 black officers, the police unions probably won't care that much about them, there's going to be complete unrest and chaos if we don't act quickly and decisively, so let's just avoid the worst, fire these cops, start the criminal persecution. It's fine this time. But then the question becomes, if that were 5 white police officers, or if that happened in a slightly different town or a slightly different state, what would the reaction have been? And even if that change resonates across the country, because the way the institutions in the West are built, it will inevitably default back to that, because police are meant to protect capital. Their whole catchphrase, I don't know what to call it, what they paint on the side of their police cars is to serve and protect. But have you ever noticed how the police departments have never said who they're serving or protecting? The police departments that evolved from runaway slave patrols, because you had plantation owners, the owners of capital, that needed their capital protected, and in this instance, the labor being provided, the physical human that is providing that labor, is considered a piece of capital, an asset in this context. Not that I think of people in that way, I'm just saying the slave patrols were created to protect capital to protect private property. They weren't there to ensure public safety. That's why when the slave patrols finally evolved into police forces and the 13th Amendment was passed banning slavery except for as a punishment for a crime, you had police departments introduce loitering laws, which basically saw newly freed slaves that obviously didn't really have a home. It made it illegal for them just to be standing around. Obviously, we've come a long way from that now, but you can see how those same laws and those same traditions perpetuate themselves throughout modern policing in America. And regardless of how many memorandums are written and sent out, regardless how many particular actions are taken by a particular department, we still have the fundamental underlying issue of the relationship of the police, the relationship of the state in the existing system we have is motivated by what is exactly contrary to the interests of the common man. The state, the corporations, the police department is in their best interest to make sure you are the least free possible, that you are as oppressible as possible, that they can generate an underpaid or unemployed workforce to have as a reserve pool of labor. So if they want to cut wages or if they want to fight unions, that they have this pool of labor that they can not only pull new labor from, but they can also use as a deterrent for anybody that is even thinking about getting involved in any kind of workplace action. They can always just turn and say, well, your job isn't that hard. We can just go hire these people and they'll work for half as much as you because they aren't making any money right now. And there is no amount of pieces of legislation or regulation that will solve those underlying motivations. Because our motivation is just to live the best life we can, working as little as possible. Of course, some people are under the impression that the only way to be a worthwhile human being is to work 100 hours a week for a corporation that couldn't give a shit about you, but that's another conversation. At the core of this, it ends up being, even if capitalism isn't descending into fascism, at the core of it, the state, the corporations, the people with the power are incentivized to screw us over as much as possible, to care as little as possible about us. Basically, to give us enough money to shut us up and keep us happy. Provide the bread and the circuses, and the people won't revolt. The revolution doesn't happen until the bread runs out, right? And that's typically what you see with revolutionary movements, is they happen as a direct result of either food shortages or just an overall internal economic or socio-political and economic crisis. Fascism is kind of an advanced state of capitalism, and I think you could argue for a lot of reasons that the United States is borderline fascist, if not it's already there, with signs of suppression of workers' movements, exactly the issue we're dealing with now. The executive branch of the U.S. government basically clamping down, forcing this union deal through, basically on behalf of the railway companies. Rampant militarism. As I've talked about in many of my other videos, the U.S. is on a war drive with Russia and China right now. It has this focus and always has had this focus on its military. Whether or not that's just a rhetorical focus or if that's an actual material focus is another debate. As we've seen, as I've talked about before, the U.S. military industry has declined quite significantly over the past few years, but the posturing of the United States military and the United States State Department in regards to its military is definitely emblematic of militarism. And then you have hypernationalism. And hypernationalism isn't just nationalism where you love your country and you would die for your country, but it evolves to this state where you believe that all other countries are inferior. And as a result of that, if people that support that kind of ideology get in power, They usually ban people from specific countries that they view as inferior from entering their country. Trump passing specific immigration laws, banning people from specific countries from traveling into America, I mean, could be emblematic of that. But again, I don't want to put this all on Trump. I think Obama, Bush, Biden, Trudeau, Stephen Harper, all these people have contributed to this since 9/11, since the Patriot Act and the Terrorism Act in United States and Canada respectively were passed. We have been on this endless drive towards either outright fascist state or something that resembles it very closely. Fascism is also exemplified by expansionism, by the empire seeking to spread its influence as far as possible, to gain as much control over as much land and territory as possible. And usually within fascism, this is kind of tied into I think it's called paleogenic rebirth kind of ideology, where you want to, your country has been ruined by various policies and people that you blame, and you want to rise it out from the ashes in this kind of violent and radical way. And usually that entails seeking more land, invading other countries, and trying to expand your territory. But in the case of the United States, I think that is better showcased in their neoliberal world order, what has happened after the Second World War, where the U.S. controls financial institutions, it controls international bodies, and it basically has a say in almost anything that happens in any capitalist country. Any country that comes to it for help, it forces that country to follow the IMF, the World Bank's rules, to liberalize their economy, to allow American corporations in basically laissez-faire to do whatever they want. And that's very similar to actually owning the territory. But you see, for example, like what's going on in Solomon Islands right now. I believe it's the province of Malta. You have a pro-democracy, a pro-West movement that went and protested and burned down or set fire to and actually killed people in the capital of the Solomon Islands, all because the government of the Solomon Islands made a choice to officially recognize Beijing over Taipei as the official political center, the official ruler of China, right? You know, recognizing China over Taiwan. And you had this protest come from an organization, Malta for Democracy, that was directly funded by USAID and World Vision, to non-profit organizations that have direct links to the US government. And you basically had them protest and riot as a direct reaction as of the Solomon Islands shift away from American hegemony and towards China. Like Brian Berletic's video, I believe he released yesterday, is where I learned a lot of this from. But you can see the Solomon Islands does most of their trade with China. It has its biggest trade surplus with China. It has a trade deficit with most Western nations like Australia. So it makes a lot more sense for the Solomon Islands in terms of what's in their best interest to pivot towards China. But the American empire can't have that, as it's relying on its expansionism, its American hegemony, to control the entire world, or at least what it can of it. Fascism is also exemplified by racism. Sometimes certain fascist ideologies sometimes more so focus on different ideologies or different religions. Obviously, you look at the party that was very popular in Germany in the 30s and 40s, and obviously they were focused primarily on religion, but also for them race did play a role. But you see other fascist regimes crop up where they're more so focused on maybe even a class of people. Like you had Duterte in the Philippines, where arguably he was a borderline fascist, but his anti-drug campaign went over or targeted what we would call the lumpen proletariat, the people that are disaffected by drugs, extensive trauma, family history. They have a history of criminality that most of the time they're led into by either their upbringing or just their surroundings. And you had Duterte basically have his police mow down these people in cold blood to resolve his drug issue. I mean, you can make an argument for the results, but the people that definitely weren't at fault were the people who were addicted to these substances. You can make all the arguments you want for the actual dealers themselves, but a lot of the people who were just regular users were punished, detained, arrested. So it doesn't always have to be racism. It could be targeting a specific class, a specific group, like gypsies that Mr. Mustache Man targeted. I believe that is a derogatory term for them. I do apologize. I'm just using the term that was used to describe them. And then you have class collaborationism. So this is the idea that the rich and the poor aren't working against each other. That the rich that want to pay us as little as possible to do as much work as possible actually have the same interests as the working class that wants to do the least amount of work as possible and get paid as much as possible. So under fascist regimes, they promote this idea that we depend on the rich and powerful to have society function, that it is only through their goodwill and charity and their success that society and people living in that society can have a good quality of life. You see how all this is kind of just describing America to a T, right? And then the supreme protection and the position of capital. So the capital, the assets, the money of corporations comes above all else. And I don't think that can be better exemplified in anything other than this derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. I'm going to be talking about the effects it's had on the people in the rest of this video, but it is very clear that the US government, the Ohio state government, the EPA as a whole believe it's more important to protect the profits and long-term viability of the Norfolk Southern Rail Company than it is to actually properly compensate these people, to take care of them, to get them new homes. They're focused more so on what is going to be best for the corporation. I got this point-by-point summary. I kind of re-summarized it for myself from a podcast from the Deprogram. I'm going to have that link below. I've more or less had this understanding of fascism, but I think at least in the first 15 minutes or so of this podcast is the best point-by-point summary I have seen of fascism, and it was just something for me to go on to make these comparisons in America. But for anybody that is interested in diving deeper on that particular issue, that particular subject, I think that podcast is definitely worth a watch. Hakeem Ugopnik and JT from Second Thought that run it are all great content creators. I couldn't recommend them enough, to be honest. But with that being said, I think it's best to move on to some of the effect this has been having, not just in East Palestine, Ohio, or just in Ohio in general, but the results we're seeing elsewhere as well. And the first one I want to take a look at, this definitely could be a slightly unrelated issue. This could be a case of another chemical or another cause of these birds' death. But here we see a parking lot full of dead birds in Lexington, Kentucky. KY is Kentucky. I'm not going to lie. As a Canadian, I had to look that up. And I also had to look up, just for my own curiosity, Lexington is here and East Palestine is here. So that is quite a whiles away. And we're seeing what is possibly the effect of the chemical spill in East Palestine extend all the way out into Kentucky. And then the first video I want to show here, this is a fella in Ontario. And to give you reference, Ontario is just north of Ohio here. I'm not sure which area in Ontario he is. It doesn't say, unfortunately. He might have said in the video, but I kind of just want to play this without sound This is from the acid rain that most likely is from the vinyl chloride that got absorbed into the atmosphere that is now raining down. But it is, you can see this rainbow colored bubbling on the ice. This ice, the rain is tainted with some kind of chemical. And if that's not from the East Palestine derailment, I would love an explanation on what it could be from. I'm a Canadian. I have dealt with ice on my vehicle several times. I can tell you not once in my life have I seen anything like that. Obviously, this isn't direct health effects from anybody or people actually being hurt, but this is kind of the warning signs that that stuff is coming. That very rare, unique cancers, lung diseases, issues with people's eyes, all that stuff is coming. It's just a matter of time. This next video was also one of the videos I wanted to include in yesterday's video, but nevertheless, we're doing a video again here today. These links, again, will all be down below, but this individual, he's also been interviewed on a mainstream news outlet just in the past day or two. Like I said, the mainstream news is just finally picking this up 2 days ago, 9 hours ago, 13 hours ago. Before the past couple days, there hasn't been very much of anything coming out of the mainstream news. But this individual, he has a shop that is right near the creek. And he's talking about the horrid smell, the smell that's now caked into his automotive shop that he has right next to that creek. And that you can smell what seems to be a chemical in the entirety of his shop. And these people were allowed back into town. They were allowed back into their homes, right? It's absolutely crazy. Hopefully I do have a link. Okay, I have missed that particular link. But I'll see if I can find it. There was a lady at the town hall in East Palestine, Ohio, where her home was actually deemed unsafe and toxic, and that came as a surprise to the mayor and the fire chief, because they were under the assumption that everything was completely safe and there was nothing to worry about. This is somebody from slightly outside of East Palestine, Ohio. They're
Days
talking
ago.
about their water.
I don't know, maybe
I've seen
4 or 5
quite
days
a
ago.
few
I got
videos about this here. So this
do
is
something here.
when these residents.
All I did was.
Sorry, I don't want to be talking over her there. Apologize. I don't have my headphones on, and I probably should. But when you boil the water, there's this kind of oily film that's on top of the water. It's hard to make out in this particular video, but I've seen it in quite a few videos. But the main thing I wanted to show this video for is this is a jug of tea, she said, that was made a couple days ago. And it might be a little hard to make out in my video here, because, again, I apologize for the TikTok videos. This is just the best place for the primary sources I have found on this particular issue. But you can see little flakes of stuff in the tea. You can see the cup itself is stained. I don't know if that's just from this person's previous use of the jug or if that's actually from the water, but there is definitely substances floating in the water, some kind of chemical substance. Of course, it could have fallen in there. It could just be some kind of dust or something, but I honestly don't think so. But again, these are all just pieces of evidence that we can use to point to the wider issue, right? Here's what I was talking about yesterday is dead chickens. This lady living in North Lima. I was trying to highlight this article beforehand, but my highlighter extension doesn't want to work with WKBN's webpage. So screw you, WKBN, and whatever reason it is that I cannot highlight the webpage, at least permanently, like I did. I think it was Newsweek was the other one where I couldn't do it, like where I do this, the green, specifically Newsweek and WKBN don't want to let me do that. So, oh well, just bear with me. But yeah, her town is 10 miles away from East Palestine, and she came home to a bunch of dead chickens, right? she also reported her eyes burning when she went into the area. She was feeling sick, and that's just a common story. I've seen dozens of TikToks now of people with extreme eye irritation living in or around East Palestine. And again, as of yesterday, the EPA, the governor, the mayor are all saying there is no issue. There is nothing to be concerned about. And again, this isn't... I see these investigative journalists trying to do a deep dive on why this happened, what were the causes leading up to it, and like they're finding the specific, like I mentioned, they overruled the safety rules, but then this is what happened in the hours leading up, and and never once touching on the idea that if everything is incentivized by profit, everybody that is trying to make that profit is thusly incentivized to make that profit as cheaply as possible and to cut as many corners as possible. Capitalists will make this argument, well, no, if it's not good quality, then people aren't going to use it. Well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative in the case of a rail line? You don't just have a secondary or a third-party rail line that you can use. There's only the one or two rail lines that go in town, and there's a specific company that owns those rail lines, so you have to deal with that rail company. Like, the whole idea that competition inspires innovation and progress only works if you're not dealing with monopoly capitalism. And that's not just one company owning the entire market, but that's also, maybe it's not exactly monopoly, but the same effect will happen when you have a lot of these corporations that work together. Especially like in the consumer goods industry, household goods industry, you have like 2 or 3 companies that own all their subsidiaries, their Colgates and Crest and Listerine, but it's really all coming from the same company. And as a result of that, they have no incentive to make their product better quality than anybody else. I think this is kind of interesting, but I watched Good Mythical Morning, I think it was from yesterday, Rhett and Link's daily podcast, and they were trying to guess the brand name. And I just thought it was funny that in a lot of these cases, not everyone, but in a lot of the cases, the brand name was actually slightly worse than the rest. And I think that's a result of those brand names having a monopolistic-like position in the market where they know consumers are dedicated to the brand, they trust the brand, so even if that brand reduces in quality, the consumer isn't going to try a competing brand, or in most cases, they're not going to try a competing brand to really see how the quality is degraded in their favorite brand. They're just going to continue to buy their favorite brand as it slowly deteriorates to be a worse quality product than anything else, but they will still have a majority of the market share because of brand loyalty. A video I did in the past touches on that very concept. Finally, though, I want to round out this video with a video I think is personally heartbreaking from a resident of East Palestine themselves. Again, once again, I'm going to apologize as it is a TikTok video, but I haven't found this. I struggled. I tried to find the actual news broadcast or a YouTube video of this, and I wasn't able to. So this is the best I have, unfortunately, and again, apologies for the headset. I need to hear the audio to make sure everything is working correctly, but without any further ado.
We need help. We do. We need President Biden. We need FEMA housing. People are getting sick.
Best Reviews has an unbiased team that researches products in real-world situations to give reliable recommendations.
This happened earlier. The Hill, you are an absolutely horrible website, and I don't understand what gives you the audacity to start your videos whenever you want and to unmute your videos and unmute the audio in your videos and just start in the background, because that happened before I started recording too, by the way. Sorry, that's a little sidebar, but The Hill, you can get bent. Anyways, back.
We should.
Oh, come on. There we go.
Housing. People were getting sick. We should not have been let back into town until all of this was done. You don't bring families back with their kids and their loved ones and then tell them to scrub with Dawn. Somebody needs to help us.
And I think that's how a lot of the residents of East Palestine feel at this point. I've seen several videos of several people just absolutely frustrated, completely lost for what they're going to do, what the next steps are. And this is just completely emblematic of the system we live under. No amount of electing a new president or changing the party in power is going to make them actually give a shit about anybody, because they're fully incentivized by profit, and that is the only thing that matters to them. If we can affect their profits, if we can do something that stops them from making money, then they care. That's why you have indigenous land protesters, pipeline protesters, the Mi'kmaq fishers, I might have said that wrong, I'm sorry, but when they were protesting for their fishing rights, that's why those people get suppressed, is because they're actually standing in the way of capital. And that's why you have other protests that are just kind of allowed to be rampant and either spiral out of control or just exist peacefully, because those don't actually threaten capital. Those people aren't taking an action like blocking a pipeline. They're just standing around holding picket signs. I don't know how much effect, I don't know what kind of statistics there really are one way or the other on this, but I don't really know what effect people standing outside with picket signs and chanting slogans will really have if it's not also backed up by an actual impact on the flow of revenue, on the flow of capital. If we're not talking about stopping production or damaging production in some way, protests and voting doesn't really accomplish much. This president was trying to pose himself as a champion of the working class. I think most of us, at least most of us that sit on the actual left, saw right through that and saw that it was going to be complete phony nonsense. But all the liberals that ended up voting for him, they stopped protesting fascism, like I said, on January 6th, 2020. Obviously, the events that happened on January 6th and the short time after, but there were protests about, I guess that would have been 2021, sorry. But there were the George Floyd protests, but I believe even those were in 2020. And you've seen protest movements in general, at least the ones that are typically supported by these organizations that have been co-opted by liberals. You've seen those all but die down. There was no support for the rail line protest, opposed to what you see going on in Britain and France, where you have hundreds of thousands, a million plus people coming out on the streets to protest things like pension reform, or the unwillingness of the British government to raise the pay in accordance with the increase in cost of living for their public sector workers. You see those people coming out, hundreds of thousands, in the street in solidarity. The locals are in solidarity with them, and not always, but especially with the most recent protests in Britain. You have the head of the railway union, Mick something, I can't remember, but he was talking about how there was actually a lot of solidarity from the public this time around. And even those rail line protests in the States, not even protests, but the threat of going on strike, you had those people called un-American. What is supposed to be a democratic country that is focused on the working man, and where anybody that just has enough gumption and can pull up their boots hard enough can achieve anything. But we don't want to negotiate with unions. We ran through things. We skip over a democratic process to protect corporations and to protect profit. Again, I guess it would loop back to my question on whether or not America is just starting its descent into fascism, or if it's already there. But I think that is more than enough for me today. We are almost up to 50 minutes total. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to anybody that continues to tune in, everybody that gives me suggestions, sends me sources. I really appreciate it. I try to be as thorough as I can, and that's why sometimes I have to do multiple videos on one subject. But it gets us there regardless, you know? But other than that, you have yourself a gooder, eh?